Welcome to the Intrazone, a show, the most accessible show about the SharePoint intelligent intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, here with my most accessible co-host, Chris McNulty.
Thanks, Mark. Today, it's May 16th, GAD Day, which stands for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So we want to focus our entire episode on accessibility, what it means, the challenges and opportunities, and how we work across Microsoft to deliver solutions making our technology more accessible to all of our customers.
Joining us today are Dr. Megan Lawrence, Accessibility Senior Evangelist at Microsoft, Eli Waalkes, Senior Program Manager on the SharePoint team, and Lauren Back, Usability Engineer with HCL Technologies, about accessibility efforts throughout Microsoft, and will narrow in all about SharePoint and OneDrive.
So, Mark, it's interesting. This is a topic in my past. I did some work with a company that focused heavily on Section 508 consulting and scanning. Section 508 is the section of U.S. federal regulation that says content should be generated and made as broadly usable as possible. So that means things like screen readers and narrators and tactile clues and things like that. I'm kind of curious, when we were framing up our episode, what inspired you to bring us to accessibility as the topic for today?
Well, when you're in these different engineering rooms and they're getting ready to get their feature ready to go out the door, you think about what's the value of the feature, what's the competitive nature of the feature, is it reliable? Then they get into what's the experience of the design team. And more, there has been this inclusion of an accessibility test, a team now. And part of who we'll talk to, Eli, from a SharePoint perspective, is part of that last mile before we put something into market. Does it meet the standards of which we hold to ourselves to be accessible, to have the technology accessible to people that need it, for people who are blind or hard of hearing or have different ailments, or like you'll hear the conversation that we get into, it may be just a period of time where things change and you need different ways to have things be accessible. And so I thought, I know it's a big thing for the company. I know it's a big thing for SharePoint, and I think it's an important part of the technology, not just to be aware of, is it or is it not accessible, but what are the benefits to those that need it and to really people that maybe don't technically need it but benefit from it.
It's interesting. What the audience may not know is internally we have a release process that one of the focal points is something we call Red Room. And it's not solely called that because someone has a perverse fascination with The Shining. It's because it stands for Ring Expansion Decision. But what's interesting is, a couple of years ago, if you looked at the arc of a release, everything that's going on when we make those go, no-go decisions, accessibility was usually a late topic. Everything's always ready, so now let's get the accessibility team to look at it and tell us what we need to change. I think accessibility is both more prominent and happens I don't know if it's been your observation, it happens much earlier in those review cycles.
I think it's from the get-go. There is an accessibility plan to every single feature, but there's the precedence that this product in its life cycle of all features needs to be accessible, point blank. And if it isn't, then it's not something that we will do, or if it isn't yet, that is something that we will work on before we will deliver it.
We have things like experience reviews and accessibility reviews that happen much earlier in the life cycle. So ideally, when we're at those go, no-go decisions, there certainly shouldn't be a last-minute surprise in those areas.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, the other side of it, just to answer your question, sort of part two of why accessibility for a full episode, is I have actually started to use the technology myself. There are three things that I've been doing most recently. Just on a Teams call, you can turn on the accessibility feature of the transcript, auto-transcript, as people are talking in real time. There's the immersive reader in Word. It's just really nice if you've gotten a longer paper to read, to put it into something that just is focused on just reading. No markup. Of course, that goes away, but just it's easier to read. And the other one is just being able to dictate, what it is that I'm trying to type in long form. It's just a little bit easier to speak it and then make smaller corrections versus feeling like I'm getting cramped by typing all day. So I've actually found a lot of benefits from using these features that were built for better accessibility, but it's also just better computing into the future, I think, is a direction that maybe is one way to think about it.
One thing I've really been exposed to a lot in the past couple of years is that diversity is a much more diverse topic than I think we'd previously realized. And, I'm really looking forward today to, I know one of the things that Megan's going to talk to us about is neurodiversity and what that means in terms of autism, and realizing that these are not just what people call disabilities about sight and sound, but people process things different ways. People have physical mobility limitations, and all of those things are not only challenges to how you build a good usable interface, but they're also opportunities for us to rethink the way that people experience technology and experience authoring, and really help them do more than they could have done just with typing.
So it's time to turn now to discussions on accessibility today on the Interzone.
Up next, we're standing around talking with Megan Lawrence, PhD, Accessibility Senior Technical Evangelist at Microsoft. I'm really looking forward to learning more about everything that we're doing with accessibility, what we can do to reach out to those communities, and what each one in our audience can do to help further this mission. So, Megan, thank you very much for coming in today.
Absolutely.
So, Megan, you've been doing this for, I think, 13 plus years, focused on the design, the implementation. Of course, a lot of the research is where you focus on, and where that leads to actually developing and then putting out into the world accessibility solutions. Just tell us a little bit about your background and then what you do here at Microsoft.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I have a PhD in geography, of all things. And so I really focused on how do we create maps or different types of representations that help people who are blind or low vision understand the world around them and how they navigate. And in doing this work, I began to realize that there were a lot of questions around how do I take ubiquitous technology that's in my pocket and on my phone, and make that accessible. So back then, which feels like a while ago now, it was all about how do we make Google Maps accessible. And I began to realize there was a real need in industry to begin to bring the voice of people with disabilities into all kinds of companies. And so I took this giant leap from being an academic, and I joined Microsoft here as the accessibility evangelist.
So just from a practical perspective, from your learnings, what was missing? What made maps not accessible at the time that maybe carried forward as these edicts of they need to do this, we need to make sure that they have X, Y, and Z capabilities? What was missing at that time?
One word: data.
Data.
Absolutely. I think when we begin to understand our environment in terms of what people with specific types of disabilities may need or want to know to make the kinds of decisions that they want. So things like bus stops. Look at San Francisco. There are 5 different kinds of bus stops. Sometimes they have covers. Sometimes they have benches. Sometimes they're only poles. Sometimes they have nothing. And so it's really hard to make a decision about how you're going to move in the environment if you don't know what's there.
Very nice. It sounds like our engineering team, data-driven decisions, and certainly to the end user, and certainly folks that can benefit from accessibility features and information or knowledge, more data. Okay.
It's one of the things that I always find fascinating. You know, you're beginning with cartography, but we can expand it to some of the other disciplines. The idea that whether through auditory or visual means, or people with neurodiversity who have different executive processing and so forth, different people will experience things in different ways, and sometimes they will notice or pick up on things that, you know, someone like me who has conventional sighting and conventional auditory skills, although my family would tell you I don't listen to anything.
It is selective, I've noticed. It's a little selective.
But the other folks are going to notice things that I would never notice, and that there's kind of new insights that we can share as a result. So I really think that like mapping is kind of a great place to kind of launch off into that. When you are thinking about the mission that you're on, that Microsoft and your team are on, around representing the voice of people with disabilities, how would you describe that? You know, when you're at a cocktail party, if you go to those, or in the coffee shop, or where have you, like, what's your elevator pitch for what's Megan's mission at Microsoft?
Yeah, so I always like to ground in the fact that 1 in 5 people have a disability today. Sometimes that's called the largest minority, but I prefer to think of it as just the fabric of society. Mm-hmm. And for all of those here in the studio and those that are listening, if you don't have a disability yet, Don't worry, you will.
Is that the wisdom of age or the age of...
Exactly. We are all aging into disability. And frankly, we all have experienced moments of temporary disability as well, right? You break your arm. You have to have eye surgery. And so for me, it's really about how do we put accessibility and disability at the heart of the way that we design products? Because when we do, we will absolutely make sure that they're accessible for somebody with a permanent disability. So let's just take this example. Imagine you have limited reach or strength, right? You've lost an arm. Speech to text becomes really important and critical. But think about all the millions of people that break their arms every year. Now, all of a sudden, with dictation that's embedded across Microsoft 365, you can type emails with your voice. You can begin to get down great ideas by simply using the dictate function. But I prefer to think of it as just flexible technology that we've all come to expect. I mean, how many people have sent a text message with the microphone on their phone? Right?
Yeah.
So again, that's just a great way of creating these flexible interfaces that move and flex with you.
I've actually found that I've started to use dictate for emails when they're just sort of off the cuff. They're not very specific or number oriented or, data or links. But, I'll start typing dear so-and-so, comma, and then I'll dictate for, a couple minutes, and then I'll go in and clean it up a little bit. And the real trigger for me was doing it, just getting comfortable with it. But I've actually started wearing a headset so that, you can talk and do some of the team stuff, which I know we'll get into as far as some other ways that we can pull speech to text. But for me, the impetus was it actually became a lot easier to do these longer form emails. And why not? But for the need to have it, if it weren't there, I would think that would be a big disservice.
You just mentioned something and I wanted to ask you. I've been observing over the last few years that, 5 years ago, Siri fails were a great meme on the internet that someone would say something and here's what actually got sent out. And in our technologies, some of the PowerPoint subtitles or when we're capturing emails, I'm seeing that happen a lot less. Is it my imagination or is there some effect that's happening that's improving the quality of this work?
Yeah, coming back to the idea of data, right?
Right.
So a lot of these systems are leveraging artificial intelligence and Microsoft Cognitive Services. And so as we get more data, right, as machine learning gets better, these services are getting better. Absolutely.
How has the shift from a perspective of Microsoft building the technology, where it is something that is then expected to be something across Microsoft 365, lots of products, not just a feature of X or Y. Have you seen the approach that Microsoft takes different in terms of how they build it, how they think about it? And certainly I think what we'll get into is the importance of it.
So, we have at Microsoft invested very deeply in accessibility and disability inclusion over the last 4 years. And that has led to significant improvement in products, and in fact, many of the ones that we've talked about today. And so I think that in doing that, there's also been a culture of inclusion that we have built. And so it's on the tops of everyone's minds, right? How is this going to be used? And we're starting to ask ourselves some of those inclusion questions. And so, in one sense, I see this as a real cultural shift that we've seen at this company, right? And then I think about users. We are in and out of so many applications, right? Throughout our day, that having that seamless experience of being able to use the tools you need and want across applications, I mean, that's just good technology.
Yeah, I have to admit, I was very excited to see that the dictate feature was in email. And it was in Word. And if I get comfortable with it, and anybody who gets comfortable with it, the applicability is certainly there across lots of different products.
So, Megan, I know there's lots of technologies and products that we're working on across the company. I'd kind of like to walk through some of our product areas and just get your take on some of the enhancements we've made, why we made them, and kind of how they benefit the fully inclusive audience that we hope we're engaging. So in Windows, we have tools like Narrator and Magnifier and Ease of Access. What's our thought process around making Windows a more accessible baseline?
So, we really think about how do we make Windows easier to use without vision? How do we make Windows easier to use when you want to have increased focus, for example, like somebody with autism? And so, again, because 1 in 5 people have a disability, because our user base is expecting flexible technology, it's not only the right thing to do, but it really is an investment in innovation. So I often say that an investment in accessibility is an investment in natural user interface design. Use the computer with your eyes only. Use the computer with your voice only.
So kind of proceeding around our tour of the Microsoft campus, there's lots of ways that people approach Office, and both from a consumption as well as a creation perspective. What are some of the things that we've been bringing to the forefront across the Office suite?
Yeah, so when I think about document creation, whoever taught you how to create an accessible PowerPoint, right? Mm-hmm. And so it used to be this very manual system where you had to know how to make something accessible. And we're moving into this sort of semi-automated system. Let's just look at the top 2 accessibility errors worldwide. No description on images and no heading structure. So now we've built heading structure into most of our templates. So use a template. Accessibility is built in. If you grab a picture off a browser like Edge or certainly any other one and you paste it into PowerPoint or Word, it will automatically create that alt text or that image description.
In another life, I did a lot of work with some Section 508 consulting, which is the U.S. regulation that governs the creation of accessible materials. I won't go through all of the chapter and verse of it. But what I think is most important there is just the awareness that someone who might look at this or listen to this differently from me should be considered. So if I'm building something that's incredibly visually busy, right? Like just to have the awareness that no one might be able to read this PDF unless they're sitting in your seat. And maybe you want to rethink this. I think it's important that we carry that message out to people too.
Yeah, I think that's the moment of empathy, right?
Right.
Imagine yourself walking in somebody else's shoes.
Right.
Disability is one of those segments that we often go in and out of throughout our lifetime. And so when we think and when we are thoughtful about creating great products, services, even simple features that really help make sure that a broad set of people can use it, it's a win.
But there definitely was a moment that kind of got me a little choked up and very proud to be associated with this company back during the holidays. And that's with what we're doing with Xbox and the adaptive controller. And, of course, that ad when you see all the kids in the neighborhood converge. It's really – I'm going to get choked talking about it.
I can feel it right now.
But how did something like that come to be? And
So recently I was in Atlanta, Georgia at the Shepherd Center, which is a rehabilitation hospital for people who have had spinal cord injuries. And most of the patients there actually are young men, risk takers, right? And so as part of what was incredibly important for each one of their recovery was their ability to get back to doing things that they loved. And gaming was a huge part of that. And so the Xbox adaptive controller is not only a way to game and have fun with your friends, but it ended up being an incredibly emotional and spiritual part of healing after a traumatic injury.
Wow.
I saw that, both in what you just described in Imagine It and, of course, the ad, that here are a lot of people that maybe because of the technology at the time had to sit on the sidelines or had to feel like they were sort of watching over somebody's shoulder. But then to give them the ability to be in the game, and especially if it's at a distance, they're playing with other people, that there just isn't the awareness of who they are and maybe what they can't do, but it's the value of that they're just playing and they are able to get in the game, which I thought was one of the bigger takeaways.
Level the playing field.
Yeah.
There's other reasons why we're doing it, not just because it's right, but to our audience who is listening to this, who may have conventional auditory skills, or the folks who may be reading this podcast. Most of our audience is experiencing things through, I would describe as the more conventional way that we typically would present it. What are the benefits of accessibility extended to everyone and not just to folks who require accessible interfaces?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of my favorite examples is the subtitling that we now have in PowerPoint. So great story from the Rochester Institute of Technology. 8% of their student population is deaf. And so they've got classrooms with both deaf and hearing students together. And they were using Presentation Translator or the subtitling in PowerPoint to make the class accessible. Well, this particular individual, a young guy, decided to drop the course. And so they said, oh, well, we don't need to do the subtitling anymore. And the hearing students revolted. Yeah, exactly. And so we said, well, why do you want this? And it really kind of came down to three things, which is one, it makes it easier when I kind of wander. We all wander. Our mind wanders. We look at our phone, right, to drop back in the conversation because I've got a couple lines I can follow up. The second one, well, this is like new information to me. I might not know all the terms. It might be highly technical. And so it was just a way to reinforce that universal design learning environment, right? Multi-sensory learning. And the last one was notes, automatic notes.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. I'd like to ask you to kind of expand on that a little further. So we've talked a lot about Microsoft's responsibility as a steward of this technology and these solutions reaching across the planet. What do you think, speaking to our listeners, to every one of you out there, no pressure, but what can each of us do in our own way to help further this mission?
So how long do we have? 5, 6 hours?
Yeah. Sure.
Great. I really honestly believe there's so many things that we can do. Before, we started recording, we talked about simply accessibility, the accessibility checker, right? Mm-hmm. We would never not spell check our document. So accessibility check your document. Make sure that it's going to be formatted in a way that people can really use. The second piece to me is about inclusive hiring. We all have the opportunity to hire or interact with people in the disability community. And I think the richer that we can make our work environments by having people with disabilities as part of that, not only do we build a culture of inclusion, but we actually create better products.
Yeah, I think there's two examples that I wanted to share with you to get your take on them that are engineering teams that Chris and I work pretty closely with have done. One is more of just a change of how we sell, so the cost of something and making it more available to the broader contingency of Microsoft 365 customers. We have a feature in Microsoft Stream, speech to text, auto transcriptioning, great to have for videos, great for search, great for transcription. And that was only available to our higher end Notion, so E5 SKU is what we call it, but the most expensive thing you can pay for, which is great because it has a ton of other value. But when they put that into the lower SKUs, the lesser cost, the use of it actually, of course, spiked. The other example, which is really what I want to get your take on, was there was a feature that we're working on right now to get ready to roll out to targeted release, so our first touch to customers for files restore. And it was doing great with the design. It was doing great with the capability of what it did. But it actually got blocked to not ship for a period of time because of accessibility. It failed a couple of the accessibility checks. How do you see that in terms of product development? Getting new technology out, but if it isn't yet ready, especially from an accessibility perspective, the value of having that as a checkpoint.
Yeah, we never like to stop ship on a product. There are a lot of people who really work hard to get this stuff out the door. But I think that's why it's incredibly important to make sure accessibility is embedded as part of the design and engineering process all the way along. So going through that accessibility design review as we begin to think about what the feature is, how it's going to surface, what's the interaction going to look like, right? And then bringing the disability voice to the table to make sure that it's not only accessible, but it's usable to the greatest number of people possible. And having great accessibility checks all the way along, right? We do have global accessibility standards. It's a great way to begin to say, hey, do I have this accessibility embedded in the way that I need to?
But we're not just low barring it. We're really trying to do it from end to end and have it be something that we can be really proud of. Not just that we checked a box, but that we're really thinking it through all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would never say, oftentimes we see compliance as minimum bar, right? But we have no interest, no engineer at Microsoft wants to be a C, wants to be average, wants to be compliant, right? We want to have that emerging technology that people never knew they could live without. And so to me, again, coming back to disability as a design constraint, it helps us think about how we build technology in a really innovative way.
So April, we're now into May when this podcast is going live. April was the month of autism acceptance. What are some of the ways that you're researching and tackling how technology, alongside raising awareness, can help individuals who are on the autism spectrum?
So, in fact, 1 in 59 people are diagnosed with autism today. So these are the classrooms that we see, and it's certainly going to be our workforce of the future. And so we have an autism hiring program here at Microsoft, but in fact, we collaborate deeply with about 16 different companies across the United States and globally that are building autism programs, to not only make them robust, but really sustainable in the long run. We get a ton of questions about how have you done it? What do we need to know? And so we recently published the Autism at Work Playbook, which really kind of pulls back the curtain and says, hey, this is what we've done. Don't reinvent the wheel. We want to share what we know.
It's one of the things I'm also really proud that we have that in our playbook. Speaking of someone, I have a family member with autism who's young, whose dream is to work at Microsoft. And part of why that's the case is because we have programs like that for neurodiversity, he can see there's a role, there's a life that pulls him forward beyond his schooling to he can see himself being on campus someday. He still is going to have to go through a lot of the onboarding questions that we do ask. But I think it's great that we have those awarenesses because it helps us as a company, as an organization, I think tap into skills that we don't have. It's not that it's a disability, it's a different ability. It's different processing, right?
Well, I think that, you mentioned, the screener, how you're going to get through the front door. And that's part of what the autism program has reinvented, which is the recruiting, interviewing, and onboarding process. And so now people with autism come to campus for 3 to 5 days. So they have that time to show what they know, interact with others. We do mock interviews. We're one of the only companies that really allows people to practice. And then they meet with several hiring managers across the company to really find that right fit. People with disabilities bring their life experience, their passion, their dedication, which is what we look for in every kind of employee. But this is what diversity looks like.
One last question for you. One thing I know that we've been committed to is taking the power of the cloud and what we've been doing with AI, artificial or accessibility intelligence in this case, to be able to unlock more solutions there. Can you comment a little on, what some of that research has been and how we're seeing that bear fruit?
So much interesting work is happening within artificial intelligence, and I can't help myself but come back to this idea of data. And so the more data that we have and understand about the disability community, the better we're going to make products moving forward. And so part of how we're doing that is through our AI for Accessibility program. It's a $25 million program where we're supporting and providing resources for NGOs, people with disabilities, small businesses, startups, academics, right? Think big here to come together and figure out how do we leverage artificial intelligence to push the boundaries of what's possible for people specifically with disabilities. And I think the important part here is that it's with, for, and by people with disabilities, right? So again, bringing the disability voice, hiring the disability community is part of what makes our company strong. Oftentimes people will say, okay, accessibility is the right thing to do. Our company should probably do that, right? But there's some new research that's been published by Accenture that shows companies that embrace best practices for hiring people with disabilities make 28% higher revenue. So we really do understand that bringing the disability voice, supporting diversity in our companies and cultures really is not only the socially conscious move, but it helps the bottom line. So TD Bank recently said to me, not focusing on disability is literally like saying to every fifth person who walks through your door, I don't really want your business. We're good.
We do not want that message to be what Microsoft says. We do not want that message.
So Megan, really appreciate your making time today. Today is May 16th, which is GAD Day, Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And so thank you for what you've been able to do today and what you've been able to do kind of throughout committing Microsoft to this mission.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure.
And hope you can stick around for our frequently asked questions in just a few minutes.
Sounds good.
Up next, We're chatting with Eli Waalkes, program manager on the SharePoint team, about how SharePoint develops with accessibility at the forefront and throughout the development cycle.
So welcome to the Interzone. Thank you for making time today. We want to start with just understanding a little bit about who you are, where you came from, what you're doing here at Microsoft, and of course, how did you get into carrying this mantle of being the accessibility or one of the accessibility people on the SharePoint and OneDrive team?
Sure. So I actually grew up around here in a little suburb called Sammamish, really close to Redmond, before going to Boston College on the East Coast. Go Eagles.
Don't get Chris started.
I know.
I won't.
Stop.
We don't want to talk about the Patriots here.
God, jerk.
Sorry, I shouldn't have even said the name.
Okay, moving on.
So I came home to Redmond, got the opportunity to work at Microsoft, which I was very lucky about. And it was cool because as soon as I started, there was a nascent culture of accessibility that was going on in OneDrive SharePoint. There was a group we call ourselves the ODSP accessibility crew. So it's people who are passionate or knowledgeable or just care about it, or all the above, honestly. I think we're all the above. And I kind of joined up with them and recognized the importance and got going on mobile accessibility.
So what drew you to that?
To me, it's the ultimate example of customer obsession. It's kind of like we can over-focus or we can over-index on, the bottom line, or we can do all that stuff. In reality, if we want to make products that customers love, we have to be customer obsessed. And this, to me, is the ultimate example of customer obsession, and how we can't just build for ourselves, and we can't just build for one customer that we have in mind. We have to build for everyone. And if we do, it makes our products better all up.
When I joined the company and I'd done a little bit of consulting in the space before, I was really happy to see this quote from Satya Nadella, our CEO. And he said, "Accessibility is not a bolt-on. It's something that must be built into every product we make so that our products work for everyone. This is the inclusive culture we aspire to create." So when you hear that statement from Satya, what does it inspire you to do on behalf of our customers?
Well, I think that customer obsession is a really big kind of idea at Microsoft. But often people don't recognize the kind of the wide nature of that, that we have to include accessibility. We have to include all of our different kinds of users. And we often limit the way we think about our products and our features to the way that we interact with them. And in reality, there's a variety of different ways that we could never imagine, that we could never truly understand. And if we don't think about them, then we're limiting. We're limiting our customers. We're not being customer obsessed. The other thing I'll say about that quote is that it makes my job a lot easier. I love it. When Satya prioritizes that with his words, he also emphasized accessibility a lot in his book. And when he does that, it makes it a lot easier for me to try and get people on board.
I like it that it just makes it an integral part of the playbook. Whatever the playbook is for anybody at Microsoft, if you're doing any feature, larger product release, even some of the stuff that we do in marketing, to have things translated into various languages, have the transcript for this episode and all the episodes, so that it's the most accessible it can be, it's the most inclusive as it can be. But to have that built in, and certainly at the top down, makes it so that I can't ship something without this key element, I think really gives us the air cover that we need. But it's also just the right charter when you really dig into what's the outcome. More inclusion, more accessible to everybody, or as many people as will listen. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The whole idea of it not being a bolt-on is so important. In the past, people, they knew that accessibility was there. We had to do it, but it was something that kind of came up at the very end, that we'd shipped a product and we'd get a complaint and we'd come back and say, okay, we have to fix this. Or do we really have to fix this? Not very many people use it. But a really, really integral part of the culture shift has to do with including accessibility from the very beginning of the process. So as soon as we start ideating on features, we got to think, okay, well, how will everyone interact with this? How will this work with the screen reader? How do we create a spec with accessibility in mind?
One theme that comes up on this show a lot, we talked to Matt Swan about it, Adam Harmons has talked about it, we talk about the fact that we run at planet scale. And so in a pure on-premises environment, accessibility for a small organization is something that might get tested or challenged once a year, depending on where their hiring practices are. But right now, as we're recording this, and right now as you're listening to this on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, there are dozens or hundreds of people who are consuming our accessible features throughout the product. I think the scale is something that really is important for us to keep in mind.
So if we dove a little bit more into now SharePoint and OneDrive and how you and your team approach accessibility, can you give us, maybe started to give a little bit, but maybe a little bit more grounding in what the general philosophy is when you consider accessibility for SharePoint and OneDrive? And if I did my research right, I came across something that is the Microsoft Accessibility Standard, or MAS. Maybe just in that context, and then we'll keep going from there.
Sure. So Microsoft Accessibility Standard MAS is kind of a confluence of a bunch of different accessibility standards. There's maybe 20 different accessibility standards that get used in the industry, the most prominent being WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And Microsoft kind of draws on all those and creates their own standard for what they expect in their products. And that's kind of the guiding rule set kind of thing, as well as like we have to at least do this. In order to be compliant, we have to do this. Mm-hmm. When I think about MAS, I think about compliance. I think about, can everyone do everything they're supposed to in a product from an accessibility standpoint?
You know, one thing we were talking with Megan about, and I kind of ask you to expand on, is remembering that two things are worth keeping in mind. In some way, 83% of us are going to encounter some level of disability in our lives. And also that the vast majority of our audience in the Interzone today is not contending with that right now. So could you give an example in terms that might not occur to everyone? Like, what's an example of an accessibility standard that we have to, not just the WCAG reference, but how does that practically play out in the development of a product?
Right. So it's funny because often the MAS standards are kind of legalese, stuff like that, but they always map back to user experience, to people. And one of the things that we don't always think about when it comes to accessibility is that it is, there's a billion people, right? And how is that, like, it's sometimes hard to understand that number, but the reality is accessibility has to do with things like color contrast. So if you're colorblind, being able to see, we have to have a certain ratio to make sure everything's visible for someone who's colorblind, as well as things like magnifiers or things for people with limited vision or low vision. So, maybe your parents or grandparents can't see the computer very well. They'll use that thing that kind of zooms in. That's all part of accessibility.
When we think about the way that OneDrive and SharePoint have approached development in the past few years, in particular, since the return of Jeff and heavy emphasis in design, one of the things we know is that we say it's not a bolt-on. It goes back to the beginning of the development and execution process. Which to me means building it into some of the earliest versions of user stories and the initial elements of design. Could you kind of expand on, like, with a measure of empathy for all of our customers, how we incorporate that into our product development early? I'd love to hear a specific example too.
Sure. So we actually have a process called Accessibility 1, 2, 3. And that's kind of, we created this maybe a year ago and we've been working to embed it into all features that get created. And in theory, there's 3 steps. There's create an accessibility spec. So when you kind of draw out a feature, you design a feature, we need to have a part of it that says, this is how a screen reader will interact with the feature. This is how you would navigate it if you were using Narrator on your PC or VoiceOver on your iPhone. And this is what it should say, and this is what it should do. And that both, outlines what the process should be, as well as guarantees that you're thinking about it from the very, very beginning. And the second step is identifying core scenarios. So when you do add a feature, you have to think about how it fits into the broader context of the application or the product. And you have to imagine, how will this be affected? What are my users doing? What scenarios are they going through where they will see this new feature? And once you identify those, we'll have an accessibility review, which is when you'll sit down with some of the accessibility experts in the OneDrive SharePoint team and say, hey, is this feature up to snuff when it comes to accessibility? Is this passing? And if it's not, then it can't be shipped.
Can you kind of translate that into what people know about, like, our release process? And if people have paid attention, like, we will start out with some pilots, and then it goes to dog food, then it comes to MSIT, then we go through all the different Red Room things, and we start putting stuff in customers' hands. When does the process that you've outlined happen relative to all of that release cycle?
It starts before all that. Before we even see it in any of those rings, whether it's just internally or whether it's just like with your engineer, we should be designing with accessibility in mind. And then once the product actually starts getting built, when there's engineers working on it, they're going to be testing throughout the entire time. They finish the feature, they have to check themselves and say, have I added all the correct labels? Have I made it so that this actually works from an accessibility standpoint? And then as it kind of gets released to these larger rings, you have more gates where it's like, we can continue to validate that it works, that it's accessible.
Was there a specific feature, without naming names, or if you want to name names, we're okay with that because the end result is the right thing?
We can name the feature, not the
feature name. Sorry, not the developer. So yes, with a feature name, or just something that maybe is rolled out recently that didn't yet meet the accessibility review, went back, made the adjustments that it needed to so that it could pass, and then rolled out. Just anything a little bit more concrete that we could share with the audience.
Sure. There was a feature on the iOS app that we had recently, the OneDrive app, where it was supposed to be, it's called item analytics. So it was a graph, a data visualization of the people who have looked at your file in the past, month or for however long it's been around. Mm-hmm. And I'll say from the start, data visualization is very hard with screen readers, right? Visualization and non-sighted users or people who are living with blindness, those things, it's a really difficult thing to solve. And so we had this design, we kind of went through this process, and then we got to the accessibility review. And we said, this is not going to work. We haven't built this in a way that it works even at all. Like it's extremely hard to navigate, and it just doesn't make sense. So we pulled the feature back. It got released internally to dog food, but it never made it to any customers. And once we kind of realized where this feature was at, we said, this has to come back. And we ended up actually redesigning the feature itself. So it went from being data visualization to more of a list view so that it can be compatible with accessibility.
The one thing that I've kind of taken away with doing a little research for this episode and hearing how you're describing it is accessibility may solve for the person that needs the accessibility, but the benefits actually are there for everybody to see the data points without maybe knowing that you have to hover or click into something, putting it more front and center, whether it's visual or not, having both or just one, makes everything more accessible or makes it easier for me just to get quicker to what I'm looking for.
So Eli, just stepping back, we've talked about accessibility testing. Can you help our audience understand what that actually looks like or sounds like? Like, how do you do accessibility testing on a practical basis? Are we working with people with disabilities? Do we have simulation software? I'd love to get your take on that.
Right. So there's kind of two different kinds of accessibility testing. Mm-hmm. There's compliance testing and there's usability testing. So compliance testing happens throughout the process. When an engineer is working on a feature, they're testing. They're making sure you can get through it. When it gets released, when the feature gets released, we go through, we send it to a vendor who they are accessibility experts. They have certifications that allow them to say, I'm an accessibility expert. And they say, okay, is this compliant? Can I succeed in doing this task? And that happens on both a feature level and a product level. So we go through monthly testing on all of our products for accessibility with these accessibility experts. And that's kind of the compliance testing part of it, which is kind of the bare minimum, which is can we actually get through everything? And the second step, and the step we really try and emphasize, and that's really important, is the usability testing. Usability testing is when we actually sit down with people who are living with blindness or who are low vision, and we go through our core scenarios with them and say, how can we make this better? How do we make this efficient? How do we make it usable? How do we make it so that you are getting, regardless of whether you're using a screen reader or any other kind of accessibility technology, are you getting the same experience that someone who isn't using that technology is getting? And that's kind of where we make the next step, where we really kind of differentiate ourselves and say, we're building with accessibility in mind. We are holding ourselves to a standard that is above just compliant. We want it to be a great experience for people.
So last question, if you, taken everything that we've talked about and everything else that's in your head, were to summarize our accessibility progress to date, what would you say today? And I think more importantly, the learnings that we have today, where does that carry us forward to even more double down on accessibility?
So I think about it in kind of two ways. I think about it in product and culture. And I think that we've made amazing strides in both. In the last couple of years, when we really emphasized this, there's been kind of an adoption of this culture of accessibility where we think about it from the beginning. It was initially more of a tax when you thought about accessibility. And now it's something that's a responsibility, it's something we need to do, and something that that everyone on the team hopefully recognizes the importance of. And that's something we can always improve on. There are always going to be people who say, I want to push my feature out faster. I don't want to have to go through it, or can try and make up excuses for why they don't need to, make it as accessible as possible.
And that's when you point to Satya.
Exactly.
Do you want to go to that guy and
the
say
big
that?
man? We got the support from the big man, and that's definitely that's very important. But at the same time, regardless of what he says, it's important. We know that we're supposed to be customer obsessed. We know that people need to use our products, and there's implications that are beyond just kind of the product level. For example, people who are using these assistive technologies, the accessibility technologies, they have a lower rate of employment than others. And the more that we can make our products better for them, the more that they can be employed to the level they should be. And so we have the support from Satya, but it comes down to the customer, the individual, and we can really make differences by making these products great from an accessibility standpoint.
So to sum up, we've made some good progress, but still a lot more ground to cover in this space.
Certainly. There's never a finish line. It's a continuous, let's embed it even more. Let's make it better. Let's keep going.
So Eli, thanks for your time today and your expertise at helping us understand where our accessibility journey has taken us. We look forward to actually catching up with you, hopefully in the future, with more progress updates as we go.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for having me again.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming. That was Eli Waalkes. He is a senior program manager on the SharePoint team. Stay tuned. We're going to be talking with Lauren Back, a usability engineer from HCL Technologies. All right, it's time to turn to chat with Lauren Back. Lauren is a usability engineer, truly an accessibility subject matter expert from HCL Technologies. Lauren, welcome to the Intrazone.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I first just want to describe a little bit of the scene here. I know I just want to hear a little bit more of what you're using in your lap. I think it is a Braille reader, and maybe just describe a little bit about what's that doing for you.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, you called me out. I'm cheating, and I'm looking at notes a little bit just so that I remember to say things.
Just so you know, I'm cheating as well.
But what I'm using is called a Braille note. It's a Braille display, which means that basically it's sort of like a tablet. If you're thinking of it as in terms of like a regular computer, I can do pretty much anything that I would do on a normal computer, except that instead of a screen, there's a display on the bottom, and I'm moving the display. The display is in Braille, and I'm moving the display with some thumb keys, and it's sort of going back and forth. And it has internet access, and there's a reader, sort of like a Kindle app. Yeah, all kinds of stuff.
So I have to be interesting, or you're going to start surfing the internet over there.
I will try not to.
Well, I have a similar setup here. I've got a Surface. You have your laptop. I say we just jump right into it.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So certainly welcome to the Intrazone. Very pleased to have you here. We've been talking to a couple of the other subject matter experts about the usability and the accessibility of SharePoint and OneDrive. And we really wanted to get it from your perspective, both in how you help the SharePoint and OneDrive team in usability tests, but also leverage the product from an accessibility perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do at HCL, and really what your main focus is when you work with the Microsoft, SharePoint, and OneDrive teams?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working at HCL for about 2 years now, and my primary job is to provide services and accessibility consultation to Microsoft. And I guess in my other life, I call it my second career. I'm a writer. I write personal essays and a little bit of poetry. And I also work on a grassroots campaign. And I'm a very amateur musician, so I play a lot of music in my spare time too. So I wear a lot of hats. And we did mention that I am totally blind. And so in my day-to-day life, I use screen reader technology. My biggest focus at Microsoft is, and particularly working with the SharePoint team, is to kind of help shift the culture so that we are thinking about accessibility early in the design process and thinking about universal design and how that's going to work for the greatest number of people.
So I'm thinking we're going to have a couple of new show note links so that if we can share some of your poetry and some of your songs, if you're so bold, I'd love to highlight that.
I'm maybe regretting letting that slip, but yes, yeah, of course.
Hey, we listen to everything and we'd love to include everything, but of course we're mindful as what you'd like to put out there.
Oh, absolutely.
But specific to accessibility, and I've also, I've been with the SharePoint team for quite some time, and I've seen their shift that you're talking about. Not that they didn't target accessibility in the past, but building for accessibility in a 3-year span for a product was different than individual features going out the door pretty much on a weekly or monthly basis.
Yeah.
When you are working with the engineers and you think about the usability and accessibility and how to make that better, who do you have in mind, and what do they need most from the product? Is this something that you can explain, your approach when you're consulting on a new product or a feature, obviously before it goes to market?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, again, it's a super broad sort of thing that I start with, which is universal access. Of course, I'm thinking about myself, right? I mean, I'm thinking about me as a blind user. I'm thinking about blind people in my community. And I'm also trying to remember that, I'm not the only user group that has, I'm not the only person with a disability in the world. And I've seen how, not just at Microsoft, but just lack of thoughtfulness towards accessibility has really affected not only my quality of life, but the quality of life of so many other people. So, of course, I'm thinking, how will this design affect a blind person? But I'm also thinking, how can we design for as many people as possible and as many abilities as possible? Accessibility is sort of about designing for diversity, and it's about welcoming people with different abilities and as many abilities as there are people in the world. I've had a lot of issues myself with unemployment and underemployment, and that's a huge problem in the blindness community. I sort of hesitate to say the statistic because it's a little bit not quite right, but it's often said that 75% of blind people are unemployed. Now, that doesn't take into account, folks that are not quite of employment age or people who are retired. It's probably more around 35 to 40%, but that's still, if you look at the number of just folks in general who are unemployed, it's staggering. So leveling the playing field is what I'm thinking about most when I'm talking with a new team.
Well, some of the statistics that we had earlier in the show were, certainly of the same caliber, where you just think of the amount of people that benefit from accessibility, that if you don't do it, you're really leaving out a huge amount of people.
Yeah.
And the way that you're leaving them out just feels wrong, especially when there's great technology to be able to tap into to help people or to just already have available that you would build for. If you didn't build for the available technology, you're missing out on a huge outreach. And of course, then what does it help, which is a core to what Microsoft's empowerment is how can we help people achieve more every day?
Absolutely. And we're in the position to be able to do that. And I just think, frankly, that it's a disservice to not.
I agree with you and 100% behind, hopefully even just the reason for this podcast, this particular episode was to highlight, I think, the great work that the team is doing and the great work that you do to help the team do it better.
Yeah, absolutely.
So are you ready to talk a little SharePoint?
Yes.
This show is all about
SharePoint.
SharePoint. So the opener of our show is SharePoint, the intelligent intranet. So as we dive in to talk about SharePoint, we hope that accessibility makes it even more intelligent. But at its core, SharePoint is a content publisher, and it has this responsibility, for all means of content consumption and creation for a wide variety of audiences. From your perspective, where does SharePoint get it right, and what are some of the areas for improvement?
I think up until Office 2013, SharePoint was pretty inaccessible and didn't really comply with a lot of accessibility requirements. And I remember this because right around that time, I had gotten my first pretty heavy admin job at a nonprofit organization.
Admin for SharePoint 2013?
Right.
Yes.
And so with the release of 2013, there was some changes, I think, in the HTML output that did make some drastic improvements. Now, I still sort of God, I don't know if I want to say this, but I kind of was like, I totally know how to use these things. Like, hire me. Come on, I need this job.
Just so you know, any SharePoint consultant you talk to always says, "Oh, sure. And then they go get 3 books off the shelf of the local library. Get up to speed.
That's pretty much what I did. I was like, I can absolutely do this. And then I spent a long time like frantically trying to figure out how to use SharePoint. And it could have been a lot worse. I did lose a little sleep. I'm not going to lie. But I think that particularly with the release of 2016 and Office in general, things are just getting better and better now. I mean, obviously, we still have a lot to do. I love the mobile experience for SharePoint and for OneDrive. Okay, so this is going to sound really simple, but like things are being labeled. Like, for example, like there are a lot of buttons and controls that you can interact with using a screen reader on the mobile app. And like sometimes in previous versions of OneDrive, the screen reader would just say button. And you're like, well, what button is it? Like, what does this button do?
Is it my shirt button?
Right,
Are we talking about a button on the door?
And so I would literally just go through and like tap on the buttons to see what activated.
Congratulations, you've sent an all-reply email to everyone. You've just shared your massive document.
Yes.
So I understand how that could get much better.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of those things have just been cleaned up, and the sort of intuitiveness of where things are has just gotten so much better.
So if buttons are obviously very important on where they are and what they do, what are some of the areas where there still needs improvement? What are some areas that, as you're looking at the screen, thinking about what's there and visualizing it, what's missing in terms of how you navigate?
Well, I mean, particularly on the web and with web apps, SharePoint and OneDrive are not an exception. They're really, there's just a lot going on. And I think when I'm using a screen reader, so the way that I picture it for sighted users, and this might be totally wrong, but you're able to sort of skim through a page and like look at the thing you want and then click on it with a mouse. With a screen reader, the way that the screen reader formats the page is it sort of puts it in a list. So you're literally with your and screen reader users typically don't have enough vision to use the mouse. So you're totally reliant on the keyboard. You're using tab and arrow keys to read down that vertical list. And so you're reading pretty much everything that's on the page. So it takes forever.
You just made me imagine my childhood, which might, again, hopefully not sound too weird, but, the screens were just a couple lines at a time.
Yeah.
And as you would scroll through, at the time I was maybe writing a paper, for junior high. Mm-hmm. It was I would think, like you're saying, a narrow view into the full context of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, but it's just sort of tedious to like sit there and listen to the screen reader read everything that's on the screen. And so how we sort of can work around that and how the design can be really effective is we have navigation keys. So for example, if you press letter B, it will jump you to a button and you can cycle through the page just pressing that B and getting to all the buttons and things that you can do. So like K, for example, will cycle you through links and H through headings and et cetera. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people still don't design for that. I just tested a product, not a SharePoint product recently, but one of the most crucial things that you would want to do with this product was not navigable by quick navigation keys. So you had to just go through the whole page. It took me like 5-10 minutes to do it when I could have done it in mere seconds if those nav keys would have been accessible.
Hopefully this was not Ayn Rand's latest novel.
Thank God it was not. But I guess what I'm saying with regards to SharePoint and OneDrive is there's just still a lot of content and a lot of options on the page. And how we can improve those is really making it so that you can jump through that content and those options a lot faster and just kind of fly through things.
I know one of the things that the team has been thinking about, and I think what you're saying actually adds to that. I think I'll definitely take it back as feedback of how to get things out of your way in terms of the left hand nav, just the chrome of it all that really gets into diving into the content and more specifically, like you're saying, get to the right content that you're looking for, not to have to go through it all every time.
Absolutely.
So we spoke with Megan Lawrence earlier, and she hit on something that resonated with us, both Chris and I, was the fact that accessibility is something that will help all of us at some point in our life and career as we age or as things happen, with accidents. How would you describe the importance of learning about assistive technology in regards to this progression?
I think that's really true. I think what Megan said is spot on. There's a disability activist that I love. His name's Corey Silverberg, and he always says, I'm not disabled yet. And I think that just really rings true. I mean, his willingness to understand and contemplate the fact that, even if you are completely able-bodied right now, there's impermanence to that. We age and we take risks in our lives and life just happens. And you just never know when something is going to change in a matter of seconds. Understanding the technology that is out there for people with disabilities can be sort of a comfort. I mean, certainly nobody likes to contemplate their demise. Not that I'm saying disability is not death. I would just like to make that clear. But I mean, you don't love thinking about it, but at the same time, knowing that is out there, knowing that people with disabilities can be integrated into society thanks to the technology that we have, and I mean should be. And honestly, I don't think that we're there yet. I mean, in my life, I experience just things on a day-to-day basis and interactions with people where there's still a lot of fear, and that makes me really sad, honestly. But I think that learning about assistive technology, like, you don't have to be like some screen reader expert or like know a bunch about like magnifiers or like stuff like that. But, just knowing that it's out there, knowing some of the things that it can do, and being able to interact with it even a little bit before you might need it, I think can be a huge comfort.
Yeah, I just in listening to how you've described, your experience and knowing that certainly things, they change, and why not be ahead of the curve?
Absolutely.
I know I've turned on, a number of things that Windows offers to listen to the narrator. Sometimes even just demoing in front of an audience, I use the magnifier so they can see a specific part easier in the back of the room.
Yeah.
But one of the things you got me thinking, and it might be just a little weird to share, but sometimes I take a cue from my dad, what may be coming for me.
Yes.
So I'll describe a little bit so my hair is now receding. That doesn't mean that I'm planting seeds in my hair. It means I'm losing my hair. But just a little bit, and I can see it coming. So every time I meet with my dad, I kind of gauge like, okay, 30 years from now, what's going to happen? But the thing that I've had to change a little bit, minor, but is the font size on a Kindle reader or on my screen. I usually pretty good about, being a couple of feet away from the screen or from the Kindle. But I've definitely, pumped up and leveraged a bigger font, which may be minor in the scheme of things. But it was nice to know certainly how to do it, and I can foresee other things.
And now
too.
right, exactly. And now you've sort of done it, and it's not that changing the font is like a big scary thing, but also, I mean, it is scary to contemplate what's going to happen. And I think the more that we understand that there's technology out there to help with that, I think the better.
I agree. Your friend Sheila Ward on the design research for SharePoint and OneDrive shared an internal video titled Lauren Gets Started with OneDrive Consumer. And it really shows you walking through the experience of getting started with OneDrive, setting it up, and then using it. And I thought, we won't share the video because it's internal video. That's not the intent.
As long as you don't share it in front of me, it's fine. I don't want to see it, but okay.
But I mostly wanted to talk about, how you work with the OneDrive team, and that's a great example. I got to see you walking through the wizard and, pointing out some things that were, in their words, bugs. Just maybe you could recreate that experience, but mostly from when you work with the OneDrive team, this is how you do it.
Sure. I have to confess, I don't even remember doing that. I sort of vaguely remember it, but that's sort of what we do every time we meet, is we walk through various scenarios. And I love working with the OneDrive team so much. And the biggest reason is that they are very consistently interested in accessibility and There are some teams that I work with at Microsoft who feel nervous about deadlines that they have, and so like they'll call me in for sort of a one-off thing, and that's totally fine. Like that's what I'm here for.
Yep.
But what I love about the OneDrive team is like it's very consistent all the time. Like we meet every 2 weeks, and we just talk through accessibility issues. I do some demos. We talk about things that are coming up, and just that sort of insistent focus that they have is really good. But I do want to say that their commitment is rare, and I would love to see other teams with that sort of drive to continue the conversation about it.
Well, we'll certainly help with that.
Yeah, thanks.
So last question, and it's specific today. When this gets published, it is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, GAD. What are some of the things that we can leave our audience to think about Microsoft, about yourself, just about the world and accessibility here on GAD Day? For this specific episode, we always have a transcript, and we always obviously try to be clear on who we're meeting with, who's talking at that time. Is there anything that you hear from other podcasts or just in your mind, what would actually make a podcast more accessible, knowing that it's just audio only?
See like how unusable that was. And I don't want to humiliate people. I absolutely don't. I'm very willing to offer a lot of grace and understanding to people when they don't know something, because you don't know what you don't know. Like there's just tons and tons of things that I don't know. But I guess I'm on like a quote kick today because I would like to quote Maya Angelou.
Please.
I mean, if you're going to quote somebody, you might as well quote Maya Angelou.
I was just about to say, Maya gets the stage anytime.
Right. I mean, she said, when you know better, you do better. And I mean, that's an interesting question because like I try to think a lot of times about, people with other disabilities, not just blind people, because there are other people in the world besides me. I try to
tune in. There were about 100 people also.
Exactly. And I mean, so I think about like people who are hard of hearing, because like for such a long time, my experience with like watching TV and movies and stuff was a little bit stilted. And now there's so much like audio described things. Like I can go to a movie theater and put on a headset, listen to what's going on visually on the screen. And so like what you said about transcripts, I think is just like super important because there's so much information now that's being relayed on podcasts that is, like an audio only medium. And while that's great for me as a blind person, because that's, I think about people who miss out on information. And I've seen podcasts that don't even have transcripts. So I'm just like, what do you...
Did you want to reach anybody?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
the most important word in that act is awareness. Over again at Microsoft, when I'm working with developers and designers, is just, I didn't even know that was an issue, or I just had no idea. And sometimes I'll leave meetings and people will be like, wow, that was really humiliating. To better is something that I try to live by. And I think a day like Glow really proactively try to raise our awareness level in what we're doing so that we can do better.
Well, I will say this then. Lauren, thank you for coming and raising our awareness, and certainly through the podcast, the awareness of anybody listening, and anytime people need accessibility, whether that's today or into the future. But your expertise today on the podcast and with the team to design better. Always push them. Don't be shy.
Yes.
I don't think you are, and I know they aren't, so they want to hear.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on the Intrazone.
It was such a pleasure.
I'm glad. Thanks.
Up next on the Intrazone, news and events. And to keep this maximally accessible, we're going to go in, we're going to go out.
Two things. First thing that we're talking about is today, if you're listening to this on the first day of publishing, is GAD Day, Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And so we just want to celebrate that the event, the big one that we want to call out, is GAD. And I'll just tell you, without being too cheeky and punny, I am glad to be here with you, Chris.
I'm glad to be here with you, too. And we'll have more resources in the show notes. And, of course, next week, the only event that matters, SharePoint Conference 2019, kicking off May 19th in Las Vegas. Hopefully, most of you are already planning to be there. Some of you, in fact, might already be poolside. We don't quite know.
I'm going to take a bet that there's going to be one person, and if you're listening now, that one person, or the 10 people, they're going to approach Chris and I and say, I listened to the Intrazone on my way over to the SharePoint conference, and now I'm all up to speed on accessibility. I'm waiting to hear that.
And if somehow, shockingly, you're in the 0.0002% of our audience who's hearing about SharePoint Conference for the first time, don't worry. If you just go to SharePointNA.com, you'll be able to stream the keynote same day. So you'll be able to find it accessible from wherever you are in the world.
I think if we talk to our friend Bill Baer, he is making the SharePoint conference the most accessible from how you understand the content, how you view the content, and of course, post-event. There's going to be a lot of things. So that's it. That's our news and events section. Ta-da!
And it raises, in my mind, more questions. So, of course, it's time now for frequently asked questions.
Yes. So after each interview, we asked our guests to stick around and share with us what their most frequently asked question was. We'll start with Megan. Megan, what's your most frequently asked question these days?
So one of the most frequently asked questions I have is, what does Microsoft have for people with mental health disabilities and wellness? So May is also the Mental Health Awareness Month. We recognize that it's the number 1 disability worldwide. 83% of people will have a diagnosable mental health condition at some point in their lives. And, we're really begin to understand, how do we help people go after that elusive work-life balance? And so My Analytics is a really interesting new tool that we have out that's beginning to surface some statistics about your behavior. Like, have you gotten the downtime that you need? Can I grab some focus time to help you be productive? So I really like where that's going.
I'd like My Analytics to do a real-time buzzer back to my Fitbit to say, you'll think better if you just get up and walk around the office for a few minutes.
Very good. Well, I think healthy mental health for everybody is wonderful.
Yeah, and I think that is very much, where these kinds of tools are going, which is to beginning to nudge or notify you to do simple things like breathe, walk, connect.
Thanks.
Very nice. Oh, that's a lot of interesting things about mental health and assistance and what we're doing here at Microsoft for mental health. Eli, on the SharePoint team, from an accessibility perspective, or just what you get lots of questions about, what are people asking you about these days?
Sure. So I get actually the question from developers a lot, which is, how do I test for accessibility? And the root of that answer is in customer empathy. It's imagining, putting yourself in the customer's shoes and seeing if you can accomplish everything with assistive technology that you could without it. So can you accomplish all the core scenarios, or is everything there? Are there visual cues that are being missed by the screen reader? And the more you practice and the more you use these technology, the better you understand how they work and the better you can test for them.
Yeah, I'm just right now imagining if just to do a fairly common SharePoint action, which is add a list item, opening up, being able to find the new button, being able to then understand what fields are being asked for, and doing that from a test perspective. Obviously, it's a very important part of SharePoint. You're actually going through that as if, what would be the experience?
Right, exactly.
Great feedback to other developers.
And then another question I get asked a lot is kind of, how do you motivate people to do accessibility, to work on accessibility? And again, this comes back to customer. It's put your feature, put your product in the hands of someone who uses the assistive technology, who uses a screen reader, and go through the scenarios with your team. Oftentimes, people can try and deprioritize things. That, it's a little bug or it's a little fix and it's not that important. But when you consider it from the customer's perspective, and when you see them actually going through those scenarios, you recognize how important it is and how every single little detail and every single little fix really does, they come together in a great experience, but you have to do them all.
I can see that taking us not just a little step, but a mile.
Thanks, Eli. One question I've heard a lot over the past few years, Megan, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, is we talk about accessible file formats. And one of the most prevalent file formats that comes out of Office is, in fact, not a Microsoft format. It's Adobe Acrobat PDF. How can someone be mindful of generating accessible content when they're taking Word, PowerPoint, et cetera, and exporting it to PDF? And one of the best tips we can give you is, if you have your Word document structured with heading tags, titles, and so on and so forth, all of those tags will be carried forward into the PDF to make it a structured document. That makes it much more usable by screen readers and people who are differently sighted. So that's the tip that I want to make sure that we're sharing about PDFs. Mark, what's your frequently asked question?
Mine is more a little bit around when is this particular technology rolling out? And that particular technology is the consistent files experience that we've been talking about. But I want to tie it into accessibility because I actually think from a training perspective, once somebody understands how to use and leverage what we do as the common files experience, if you learn how to do it once, as you move to Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive, or Teams, it should be the same consistent experience. So we're bringing that technology soon. We certainly started within SharePoint. It's coming to OneDrive, coming very soon to Microsoft Teams as the new files experience in the Files tab. But I think on topic, not only is that it's coming soon, we've been talking about it for a while, and I think we're very pleased on the implementation that is a unified singular control so that if you learn how to do anything with files in Microsoft 365, when you see another file, you should expect it's that same experience. And from an accessibility perspective, a lot of those features are accessible, and of course, they're going to be now consistent so that once you learn it once, you'll then have a really good understanding of what to do whenever you come across a file.
Well, that's great, Mark. And thanks again to all of our guests for sticking around for frequently asked questions.
Thank you to our guests, Megan Lawrence, Eli Waalkes, and Lauren Back for sharing all their expertise about accessibility.
Check out our show page for links to all of what was discussed today and more. Go to aka.ms/theintrozone.
We love hearing from listeners. Do send us your questions and feedback for the SharePoint teams.
You don't need to reach us via Raven. You can use email to contact us at theintrozone@microsoft.com or out on Twitter @SharePoint, @mcashman, and @cmcnulty2000. Apologies for the gratuitous Game of Thrones reference.
Tell all your friends and colleagues about the show. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks so much for listening. We're your hosts, Chris McNulty and Mark Cashman.
This has been The Intrazone, a most accessible show about the SharePoint Intelligent Intranet.